Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with new and improved sourdough bread. That's right, I've been working on this for over a year, and I'm very excited to share what I think is a more delicious loaf, a more nutritious loaf, and thanks to the new folding techniques I'm going to show you, features what I think is the ideal crumb structure, not to mention a gorgeous, crispy, and pretty much perfect crust. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Or should I say startered? Since I'm going to start this bread with 100 grams of sourdough starter, and once we zero the scale out, I'm going to add about 15 grams of bread flour, about 15 grams of whole wheat flour, and then about 5 grams of rye flour, for a total of 35 grams of flour. And once those are in, we will zero the scale again, and we'll add 35 grams of cold fresh water. And by the way, if your scale happens to jump up a gram, do not try to remove a gram of water. Okay, we want to be precise, but not insanely so. And then what we'll do is take a spoon and give this a mix to create what we call in the bread business a levain. And by the way, if you don't have any sourdough starter, just go back and watch our last sourdough video where we show you how to make it. Or just ask around with friends or family or one of those neighbor apps. And believe me, someone will be happy to give you 3 or 4 tablespoons to start with. And then what we'll do is cover that loosely with the lid. And then we'll let it sit out at room temp for about 5 hours, or until it about doubles in size and is beautifully bubbly and very active. And hopefully it's going to look something like this. But, and this is very important, about 3 hours into the levain process, okay, about 2 hours before it's going to be ready, we're going to do a step called autolyse, which is simply mixing our flour and water together and letting it sit for a few hours before we start our dough. And I'm going to start with 135 grams of wheat flour, and then 365 grams of bread flour, for a total of 500 grams exactly, give or take a gram. And then I'm not sure why, but I like to give this a mix before I add the water. Or you probably don't have to, but I am going to make a well in the center anyway. And it is fun to stir things. But either way, we will zero out our scale, and then add exactly 425 grams of cold fresh water. At which point we'll take our spoon and give this a mix until everything's combined. And by doing this a couple hours before you add the levain, we give that flour time to hydrate, especially the wheat flour, which takes longer. And the result is a dough that's easier to work with. Plus, according to people that know these things, it's going to taste better and look better. And then once that's mixed, we'll take a flexible plastic bench scraper. Okay, the one with the rounded edge, which we'll use when we're working in the bowl. And we'll clean off our spoon and scrape down the sides. And then later, as you'll see, we'll need the stiffer metal flat bench scraper, which we'll use when we're folding the dough on the counter. And once we have that cleaned up, we'll cover it and let it sit, like I said, for 2 hours. After which it's pretty much going to look exactly the same, except it will kind of have slumped down in the bowl. And at this point we can go ahead and now grab our fully fermented levain, and I'm going to give that a stir so you can see how beautifully bubbly and gassy it is. And by the way, if your levain looks like this and it's ready to use, but your autolyse has not gone 2 hours yet, it doesn't matter, just start making bread. Okay, even an hour of autolyse is fine. And what we'll do is place that on the scale and zero it out, and then add exactly 70 grams of our levain. Which, by the way, is the exact weight of the flour and water we added to our starter, which means we'll have 100 grams left, which we'll pop in the fridge, and we'll use that to make the next batch. Oh yeah, it's the perfect system. And then what we'll do is move the scale and grab a cup of water for our fingers. And we will also at this point add our salt around the outside, around the outside, around the outside. Since I think it's bad luck to add the salt right on top of the levain. And then what we'll do is wet our fingers and go around folding the dough like this in an attempt to mix that salt and levain in nice and evenly. Oh, and in case you're wondering, that was 11 grams of kosher salt. And don't worry, I'm going to list all the exact weights in the description. But anyway, we'll mix everything together, wetting our fingers when needed. And also, I generally like to put a towel under the bowl, just so we don't have 2 hard things banging into each other. And thanks to that autolyse step, this dough is already going to be fairly elastic, which means we're off to a great start. And after a couple minutes of doing what you just saw me doing, we should be able to form this into a relatively uniform ball of dough. And once that's been accomplished, we will cover it, and we will set our timer for exactly 15 minutes. At which point we'll uncover it, wet our fingers, and perform what I like to call the old flop and turn, which means grabbing the dough on the edge of the bowl, and then flopping it over the top, and then turning the bowl a couple inches, and then grabbing that dough right where the crease was formed from the last flop. And for this first set, we're going to keep going until the dough really isn't into it anymore, and it starts springing back, resisting your ability to flop it all the way over. And once that happens, we will stop and kind of turn over the dough, and then using some nice damp fingers, we will kind of slide our hand underneath the dough in an attempt to get a nice smooth skin over the top. But this was just the first step, so we don't need anything too perfect here. Just get it looking anything remotely similar, at which point we will cover it up, and we'll set our timer for another 15 minutes, at which point we'll do the exact same thing. And what the game plan is here, we will do 3 sets of the old flop and turn, 15 minutes apart, and then after that, as you will see, we will move to working on the counter for 3 more sets of a completely different type of fold. And the purpose of all this manipulation is to build up a very strong gluten structure, and the stronger this structure is, the higher your bread's going to rise, and the better your crust's going to be. And as you will see, you're going to have a beautiful crumb structure, which is what bakers call those holes you see when you slice the bread. Oh, and I should mention, the reason this video is going to be so long is because I wanted you to see all these steps in real time. And I really dislike the sped up time-lapse footage. So you can watch this on a higher speed if you want, but I didn't want to edit things tighter, and I wanted you to see how it's really going to look. But anyway, like I said, we're going to perform the old flop and turn 3 times, doing those 15 minutes apart. But after we finish the last one, we're going to set our timer for 30 minutes, at which point we'll do the next 3 folds on the counter. And by the way, pro tip, before you scrape your dough onto the counter, I like to rub a few drops of water on the surface, which is going to help prevent the dough from sticking. And once down, what we'll do is wet our fingers and perform what I call the old stretch and fold. Okay, we'll sort of slide our fingers under the corners, stretching the dough out into some kind of square shape. And the bigger we stretch it, the better. But this is just the first one, so something about 12 inches wide is fine. And then what we'll do is grab the corners and fold this into thirds. And then we'll grab the top end and fold it in half back towards us. And then we'll dampen our fingers and put our thumbs right in the center, and we'll fold the dough back, at which point we'll sort of roll it up towards us, stretching the dough as we go. And then we'll dampen our hands again and use sort of a circular motion to turn and rotate this back into a ball of dough, which we can just do with our hands. But if we want, and most people do, we can use a flat bench scraper. And I'm trying to do this a lot slower than I usually do. But what we're doing is sort of giving it a turn, and towards the end of that turn, we're using that bench scraper held at an angle to first and foremost get this back into a ball shape. And yes, you can use either side. And that's it for the first 30-minute fold. We did pretty good. And once we're happy with that reshaping, we'll transfer that back into our bowl, and we'll set our timer for 30 more minutes, at which point we'll perform the old stretch and fold for a second time. And one of my favorite parts of this whole operation is feeling how the dough is changing as we do these folds. Right, keep in mind that yeast is growing, and our dough is rising and getting more elastic. And each time we do this, once we finish, it's holding its shape a little better, which again is the whole idea of these movements. All right, we could just let the dough rise without doing anything to it, and then eventually shape our loaf and let it proof and bake it. But it is just not going to be nearly as impressive. Okay, so that was fold number 2, and we'll grab our bench scraper and use that rotate with a little push at the end method for shaping this back into a nice tight ball of dough, at which point it goes back in the bowl and gets covered, and we set our timer for 30 minutes, which will bring us up to the third and final old stretch and fold. Oh, and while that happens, let me brag a little bit. Okay, most of those really picturesque sourdoughs you see online, with that beautiful crust and gorgeous open crumb, those are generally done with mostly bread flour and maybe a little bit of wheat flour. But here we're using like 36-37% wheat flour, which is generally considered not as easy to work with. But the advantage is, this produces, in my opinion, a bread that has more flavor and definitely more fiber, which makes it more nutritious. And as long as we're performing all these folding and shaping steps, we can totally get away with it. And after this second fold, and definitely after the third one, when we switch to the bench scraper to form this back into a ball of dough, besides achieving a nice uniform shape, when we finish that turning, rotating motion, we want to concentrate on pushing with the side of the scraper, which, since the dough is sort of sticking to the counter, is going to help stretch the dough at the top, nice and taut. And a nice smooth tight surface on top of your dough is one of the keys to a great loaf. And that's it. Finally, our 6 folds are done. And we will transfer that back into our bowl and cover it up again. And then we'll let it sit on the counter for about 4 hours, or until it's beautifully bubbly and has about doubled in size. And in case you're wondering, this step is called the bulk ferment. And exactly how long it takes depends on the temperature of your kitchen. And if everything goes according to plan, it will hopefully look like this. And if you give the bowl a wiggle, the dough will jiggle. Oh, and if the lighting looks different, that's because it's dark now. I mean, we started this thing like 11 hours ago. But anyway, after the bulk ferment, we will scrape that dough onto our counter, and then we're pretty much going to do the same stretch, fold, and form back into a ball move that we did during those last 3 sets of folds. Except now the dough is in a much more fluid condition, and it's not going to be quite as easy, but you'll still be able to get it done. And if some of the dough tears or sticks or breaks off, just grab it and stick it back on. And I mostly will use some damp hands for this, since damp hands don't stick. But feel free to switch back to the bench scraper at any time. And while I don't want you to be afraid of deflating the dough, I also don't want you to unnecessarily deflate the dough. So we'll want to try to be a little more gentle, but we do want to get it back into a ball, with again a nice smooth skin on the top. And once that's been accomplished, we will dust the top with flour, and we'll set our timer for 30 minutes, since what we just did is called the pre-shape. And after 30 minutes, we will finish up with the final shaping. And fair warning, during that 30 minutes, the dough is definitely going to flatten out a little bit, which is totally normal and fine. And then after the 30 minutes, we will lightly dust the surface next to the dough, since our next move is to take the bench scraper and use it to flop it over with the flour side down. And then I also like to get a little bit of flour on my fingertips, at which point we'll do our final trifold. And again, I don't want you to play scared, but I do want you to concentrate on being gentle and not deflating this dough any more than necessary. And by the way, unless you've felt a sourdough at this point, you have not really lived a full life. It just feels unbelievably good. In fact, it's tempting to touch a little too much and a little too long, which I actually might be doing here. But I caught myself and eventually decided to stop. And then for one last time, we'll take our bench scraper and, to the best of our abilities, shape this into a nice round ball that's as high and tight and perky as possible. Oh, you heard me. As perky as possible. And for this last shaping, make sure you take your time, since we really do want, and stop me if you've heard this before, we really do want a nice, smooth, very tight skin of dough over the top. And then once we do reach peak perkiness, what we'll do is stop and get this into our bread basket. But before we do the transfer, we'll want to dust the top with flour. And after we do that, is it necessary to caress the flour over the top? No. Should you do it anyway? Absolutely. Man, that feels good. And then what we'll do next is grab our banneton, which has been generously dusted with rice flour, and we will carefully but confidently slide our bench scraper under the dough and flip that over onto our hand, and then very gently lower that into the basket, at which point we'll perform an optional, but I think critical step, which is called stitching the dough. And we want to be semi-gentle, but what we'll do is grab some dough and pull it up over the top, and then grab some from the opposite side and pull that over the other way. And we'll do that like 3 or 4 times. And what that does is make the skin around our dough even tighter. And then as soon as we do that, we'll go around sprinkling a little flour around the edge, since even though it's sitting up nice and proud now, as this sits in the fridge, it's going to spread out. So sprinkling around a little flour at this point is not a bad idea. And that's it. We're going to cover this back up, and we'll pop it in the fridge to proof overnight, since I like to put this loaf in the oven exactly 14 hours after it goes in the fridge. And some people use a poke test instead of going by time, but I haven't found that reliable. So I just simply bake 14 hours later, and it seems to work out pretty well. But the next day, an hour before that happens, we want to put whatever we're going to bake our bread on or in the oven and preheat it to 500. And what I'm going to use is this cast iron bread baking pan called a Challenger, which is basically an upside down Dutch oven. But no matter what method you're going to use to cook your sourdough, we're definitely going to want to preheat the oven first. And while that's happening, I'm going to prep my parchment, which we'll do by folding it in half, and then we'll use some scissors to cut around, forming a nice oval shape. And we'll use this parchment to transfer our dough onto the pan. or as some of you like to use, into a Dutch oven, or onto a hot pizza stone or just regular baking sheet. And then we can also grab our bread lame, which is a razor used to score the loaf, plus some nicely insulated oven mitts to get our pan in and out. And that's it. Once our oven's been at 500 for an hour, we will pull out our dough and take a look. And at this point, it's been proofing in the fridge for 14 hours. And as I mentioned, some people like to poke it to test to see if it's ready to bake. But I can never really tell what's happening. Right? Some spots we poke will spring back, and some spots will stay depressed, which again is why I just like to go with the time. And what we'll do is place our parchment over the top, making sure it's centered, and then we'll very carefully flip it over and gently lower it to the counter while we slide our hand from underneath. And then once we've removed the banneton, we will take our lame, or a razor, or any sharp knife, and we'll make a cut at a 45-degree angle about 1/4 inch deep, all the way across the loaf about 1/3 in. And once that's been accomplished, we will put our gloves on and take our pan out of the oven. And by the way, I oiled this so it would look nice for the video, which explains that wisp of smoke you're going to see. And what we'll do is carefully lift the parchment up and transfer the loaf on. And then before we cover it, we'll add 2 ice cubes, 1 at each end. And it's that trap steam produced by the ice that's going to give us what the pros call oven spring. And what we'll do is put our gloves back on and place on the lid. And we'll bake that covered at 500 for exactly 20 minutes. So we will set a timer. And 20 minutes later, when it rings, we will open the oven and take off the lid. And then you don't have to, but I'm going to turn this around so you can get a peek at the ear. And then to finish, we will lower our heat to 450. And we will bake this for another 35 minutes, at which point you should be looking at a beautifully browned, beautifully risen, absolutely gorgeous loaf of bread that hopefully looks like this. Oh yeah, check it out. And hopefully you can see that beautifully blistered crust, which you will definitely get if you use the Challenger with the ice cubes, or even just a Dutch oven that's covered with the ice cubes. And at this point we have our toughest challenge, which is letting this cool for 1 hour before we slice in. Since if you slice in hot, you're going to lose a lot of steam, which is moisture, and you'll end up with a drier product. So please let it cool before you slice in, which I did. And even if you do everything right, and it bakes up and looks nice, you really never know what the crumb structure is going to look like. All right, sourdough is like a box of snowflakes. You never know what you're going to get, and they're all different. But as you can see here, we pretty much nailed it. And for a sourdough with this much wheat flour, I could not have been happier with the results. So pretty much perfect inside check. But what about the crust? Is it going to be nice and crispy? Well, you know what? Take a listen. Oh yeah, that sounds about right. And then as far as the taste goes, it's pretty much indescribable, which means I won't be able to describe it, but I will be able to spread on some goat butter and take a few bites so I can marvel at the magic that is homemade sourdough. And by the way, if I was forced to describe it, I would say it has the perfect level of tanginess, right? Beautifully sour, but not too sour. And as I've already mentioned, I think sourdoughs that have a good amount of wheat flour are always more flavorful and a little more satisfying. And yes, it took like 2 days to do, and there was a million steps, but all the steps really are fairly simple and only take a few minutes each to complete. Right, the hardest part is figuring out the timing of when to start it so that you're able to bake this at a decent hour. All right, I generally like to get mine in the fridge proofing about 11 p.m. so I can bake at 1 p.m. the next day. But anyway, that's going to be up to you. I mean, you are, after all, the Chef John of this sourdough bread marathon. Speaking of which, if you made it through this entire video, which may be the longest one I've ever posted, I want to thank you very much and tell you how much I love you. And I'll finish up by saying, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.